Welcome, brave viewers, to another journey into the deepest shadows of human history. Before we begin, steel your nerves. Some stories crawl beneath the skin and refuse to leave. Some force us to question what we know about civilization, humanity, and the fragile boundaries between safety and savagery. Tonight's tale is one of those stories, because while most legends are born from imagination, a few are carved from horror. And along the remote coastline of Scotland, where the waves strike stone like bone against bone, a nightmare once grew in the cold darkness of a sea cave, fed by hunger, fear, and the kind of evil that does not fade with time. If you enjoy stories like this one, dark, historical, and unsettling, remember to subscribe. Now take a breath. The night ahead is long. The year was uncertain, somewhere in the shifting centuries between medieval chaos and the uneasy peace that followed. Scotland was a land torn between clans and kings, saints and sinners, superstition and survival. At the northern edge of all this turmoil, far from the comfort of towns and far beyond the reach of the royal courts, lay a region so isolated that even the bravest travelers hesitated to cross it. Bennane Head, a place where the cliffs rose like jagged teeth from the sea, where the wind could slice through wool and leather with pitiless sharpness, and where night seemed to fall faster and heavier than anywhere else in the kingdom. Farmers said the darkness here was different, not just the absence of light, but a presence in itself, creeping over the land like a living shadow. On stormy evenings, villagers swore they heard faint cries carried on the wind. Some thought it was only the crashing waves echoing against the cliffs. Others whispered that it sounded too human, too frightened, too real. But no one lingered long enough to find out. Most who traveled these coastal paths moved quickly, clutching the handles of their carts or pikes with white knuckles. They prayed not to twist an ankle, not to wander off the road, not to fall behind their companions. Because people had begun to vanish. One here, two there. A family lost in the span of a season. At first, these disappearances were blamed on bandits, wolves, shipwrecks, natural dangers, rational dangers. Yet rationality frayed thinner each year. A merchant on horseback never made it to the next village. A pair of newlyweds traveling home for the first time were last seen smiling in the morning sun. By dusk, only their horse returned, panicked and frothing. Fishermen found scraps of boots and torn tartan washed up on the rocks. No bodies, never bodies, but remnants. Rumors spread like wildfire, demons in the hills, witches in the coves, spirits hungry for blood. Still, life continued, as life does. Fear becomes familiar when it does not kill you outright. But even the villagers, hardy and accustomed to hardship, could not ignore the sensation that they were being watched by something unseen. The forest felt too quiet, the cliffs too empty, the roads too exposed. Every broken branch became a warning. Every rustle in the bracken tightened the breath in one's chest. On one bitter evening, with mist coiling low over the heather, an old shepherd named Alistair trudged homeward. His flock had grown restless that day, bleating and shifting as though something moved among them unseen. He cursed the mist, cursed the cold, cursed his luck, and yet the unease remained lodged like a thorn in his mind. The sun slipped behind the mountains, leaving only a smear of dying orange light on the horizon. The path narrowed between thorn bushes and the cliff's edge. Alistair stopped. He heard footsteps behind him. Not the soft shuffle of sheep, not the echo of his own boots. These steps were lighter, quicker, intentional. Someone or something was following close enough to touch. "Who's there?" he barked, gripping his crook. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. No birds, no insects. Even the sea seemed to hold its breath. Alistair squinted into the growing dark. A shape shifted between the rocks. Small, low, slinking. Then another shape, taller, hunched. His heart seized. Bandits? Wolves? He couldn't tell. He backed away slowly, forcing himself not to run. Running meant panic. Running meant death. He nearly made it to the bend in the path. Nearly. A hand, cold, coarse, unnaturally strong, shot from the shadows and clamped around his wrist. Alistair screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. More hands grabbed him. Too many hands. Dozens of pale, mud-smeared limbs, reaching from the dark like spiders from their nest. He glimpsed faces twisted with hunger, eyes too wild to belong to sane men, teeth glinting in the last thread of daylight. Then he felt the pull, downward. Into the dark beneath the rocks, into a crack in the cliff, into a place where no honest soul was meant to return from. Alistair disappeared. Not a scream, not a trace, only the echo of his crook clattering onto the stones. By morning, villagers whispered that he must have slipped and fallen into the sea. A tragedy, yes, but not unusual. The cliffs were unforgiving. But as the days passed, the shepherd's sheep wandered home alone, bleating desperately. Their wool caked with some dark stain the villagers tried not to examine too closely. More disappearances followed, quiet ones, lonely ones. A washerwoman who never returned from the stream, a peddler traveling between villages, a boy gathering firewood, all vanished without explanation, and always near Bennane Head. The land itself seemed to recoil from the place. The grass grew patchy and pale. No birds nested in the crevices. Even the wolves avoided the rocky coastline. Travelers began marking their paths with carved charms, against evil, warnings for the next passer-by. But warnings were useless, for deep beneath Bennane Head, hidden behind a narrow cleft in the rock that even seasoned climbers would overlook, lay a cave that the sea only revealed at low tide. A cave with chambers snaking far into the earth, where the air grew stale and the darkness felt almost alive. Inside that cave, fires burned low. Bones were stacked high, and in the flicker of torchlight, shapes moved, crouched, whispering, waiting. They watched the world above. They listened for footsteps on the road. They hungered. No villager could have imagined that a single couple was slowly growing a clan in that cavernous womb of stone, a clan that lived beyond morality, beyond fear, beyond humanity, a clan that learned to thrive through blood and flesh and secrecy, a clan that would one day be known as the Beans. But for now, the villagers knew only the pattern, footsteps coming down the road, silence, then nothing. Civilization frayed at its farthest edge, and no one realized that the darkness was not merely rising, it was already here, watching, growing, preparing to feed again. The truth about monsters is that they rarely appear fully formed. They do not crawl out of the shadows already sharpened, already wicked, already hungry.
Monsters are made step by step, shaped by choices, nurtured by cruelty, and allowed to rot unchecked until the rot becomes all they are. And so, long before Scotland whispered the name Sawney Bean with terror, long before the roads emptied at night and the cliffs became feared more than storm or sickness, there was simply a boy born into poverty, into anger, into a world where survival was not a right but a ruthless gamble. Alexander Bean entered the world in a cramped, damp hut on the outskirts of East Lothian. His father was a ditch digger, hard labor for little coin and even less respect. His mother eked out a living doing whatever work the village women shunned, cleaning slaughterhouses, gutting animals, scraping hides. It was foul, thankless labor, work that clung to the skin and the soul with equal bitterness. From the day young Alexander, or Sawney as the local tongue eventually reshaped his name, learned to walk, he learned to wander. He never cared for chores, never cared for the grinding honesty of peasant life. While the other children helped herd goats or fetch water, Sawney lurked in the fields, watching, always watching, not with the playful curiosity of boyhood, but with a quiet, calculating stare that unsettled even the adults who caught him doing it. Neighbors whispered that something was wrong with him. Not mad, not cursed, just wrong. He had a way of smiling with only half his mouth, a way of speaking that slid between lies and truths without distinction. He stole from gardens, then from stalls, then from pockets. Not out of hunger, his mother always managed enough scraps for the table, but out of something colder, something closer to thrill. What frightened people most, though, were his eyes. They were always searching for weakness, studying how others flinched, how they cried, how they pleaded. He seemed fascinated not by life itself, but by its vulnerability. By the time he reached his late teens, Sawney had gained a bitter reputation. Men spat at his feet. Women ushered their children indoors when they saw him coming. The local magistrate supposedly said he'd sooner trust a starving wolf than a boy like that. But Sawney did not care. He felt no embarrassment, no guilt, no place in the rhythms of human society. Work was beneath him, authority meant nothing, and rules were merely obstacles waiting to be pushed aside.
Eventually, after a violent quarrel with his father over lack of work, lack of discipline, and lack of shame, Sawney left home. He walked away without a backward glance, stepping into the wilderness as if he had been waiting to do so all his life. It was on that road that he met her, a woman named Black Agnes Douglas, though whether that was her real name or the invention of storytellers, no one would ever know. What is known is that she was as feared in her village as Sawney had been in his. Sharp-tongued, unpredictable, and expelled after accusations of witchcraft, theft, and violence, she drifted along the fringes of society like a storm without sky or season. When Sawney met her, she was sitting by a dying fire, sharpening a rusted blade. He saw the wildness in her eyes. She saw the cruelty in his smile. They did not fall in love. They recognized each other, the way two predators recognize another of their kind. They traveled together afterward, a mismatched pair held together not by affection, but by shared disdain for the world. They refused work from farms. They robbed travelers of what little they carried. They laughed at the villages that rejected them, sneering at the rules others lived by. And together they grew bolder. One night, while sheltering in an abandoned shepherd's hut, the two argued fiercely over how to survive the coming winter. Sawney complained about hunger. Agnes complained about cowardice. She spoke of the cruel ease with which people died, how soft they were, how trusting. "Flesh is flesh," she hissed, staring at him through firelight that made her cheeks hollow and skull-like. "Sheep, cow, man. Hunger doesn't know the difference." Her words lingered. They did not horrify Sawney. Instead, they fed a nameless idea that had been germinating in the dark corners of his mind, something he had once glimpsed while watching a butcher carve meat, something that stirred whenever he saw the frightened eyes of a traveler isolated on a lonely road. The idea became a whisper. The whisper became a hunger, and the hunger grew teeth. At first, they tried to continue drifting between villages, but the world offered them no welcome. Doors closed, roads were guarded, their reputations preceded them. Eventually, they grew weary of wandering, weary of hiding from angry villagers, weary of cold nights without safety or shelter. Agnes was the first to speak the thought aloud.
"We should go where people won't follow," she murmured one evening as they looked out across the desolate coastline. "Someplace forgotten." Sawney stared at the sea, the endless gray, the relentless crashing waves, the cliffs like natural fortresses. He felt something stir in his chest, a promise, a future not shaped by laws or judgment, but by their own desires. So they walked. They followed the coastline, scaling rocks and navigating treacherous paths worn thin by centuries of tides. Days passed. Nights grew colder. The world around them grew more inhospitable, more isolated, more wild. And then, as if the land itself were guiding them toward their destiny, they found it. A narrow slit in the rock, barely wide enough for a grown man to squeeze through. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a deceptive shadow. But when the tide receded, the opening became accessible. The smell of sea brine wafted outward, mixed with the damp musk of earth long hidden from the sun. Sawney stared at the entrance. Agnes stared at Sawney. "This is it," she whispered. Inside, the cave opened like the throat of a giant beast. Tunnels branched off into natural chambers. Some were tight and narrow. Others were tall enough for a man to stand without ducking. The deeper they walked, the darker it became, until even the torch Agnes carried only illuminated a few trembling inches of space. But the darkness did not frighten them. It welcomed them. It felt like a womb, hiding them from the world that had rejected them both, a place untouched by law or civilization, a place where hunger and the means to answer it could be pursued without consequence. They settled there that night, huddled against the stone walls as the tide roared outside. Rain lashed the cliffs, wind howled like tortured spirits. But inside the cave, they felt safe, hidden, finally home. It was on one of their earliest nights in that cavern that the whisper of hunger became action. A lone traveler, lost in the storm, stumbled near the rocks calling for help. Sawney and Agnes listened. They exchanged a glance, silent, knowing, inevitable. The man never made it past the cliff. Sawney ambushed him with shocking ease, dragging him down before the storm could drown out his screams. Agnes helped pull him into the cave. The rain washed away the blood on the rocks.
Inside, they made their first kill. For hours, the storm raged. For hours, the cave echoed with their breaths, their whispers, their ravenous chewing. And when dawn came, nothing remained of the man except scraps of cloth and a few unrecognizable bones which they tossed back into the sea. They had crossed a threshold no human should cross, and neither felt regret, only satisfaction. From that night onward, Sawney changed. Something in him awakened, something dark, triumphant, liberated. Killing became easy, eating became routine, morality became meaningless. And together, in that cold, echoing cavern beneath Bennane Head, Sawney and Agnes forged not just a life, but a legacy built on blood, secrecy, and an appetite that would soon grow beyond the two of them. In the dim glow of the cave's first fire, Agnes placed a hand on Sawney's cheek and whispered the words that sealed their fate. "We're free now, Sawney. Free to be what the world always feared we were." He believed her, and the darkness believed in him. At low tide, the entrance looked like a wound in the side of the earth, thin, jagged, and easy to miss unless you knew precisely where to look. But to Sawney and Agnes, it was more than an opening in the cliffs. It was a threshold, a boundary that separated the world they despised from the dark promise of a world they intended to build. A kingdom shaped not from stone and gold, but from secrecy and hunger. In the early days, life inside the cave was harsh. The air was thick with moisture that clung to the skin like a cold second flesh. Every sound, dripping water, scurrying sea creatures, the distant growl of the tide, echoed endlessly through the caverns. But they adapted quickly, exploring the twisting tunnels with a determination that bordered on obsession. They learned the cave's moods. When the tide was rolling in, a deep rumble traveled through the stone, like the heartbeat of a slumbering beast. When it receded, the air shifted and cooled, pulling drafts through narrow cracks. Sawney could tell the time of day by the way the light seeped through the entrance, thin and sickly at dawn, fading to nothing as night fell. Agnes, meanwhile, mapped the place with instinct rather than logic. She would run her fingers along the damp walls, marking the paths that felt safest. Sometimes she whispered to the darkness as if it answered her, nodded as if hearing something Sawney could not. Together, they carved out their territory.
They chose a chamber deep within the cave as their main refuge, a space where the ceiling arched high and the floor was dry enough for a bed of woven heather. They dragged driftwood inside for burning, stacking it against the walls. When flames crackled, shadows somersaulted across the stone like frantic spirits. But even in those first nights, the cave felt too large for just two people, an empty kingdom yearning for subjects. And the darkness around them felt hungry. On their second week inside the cave, a storm slammed against the cliffs with a ferocity that seemed almost personal. Waves collided with the rocks so violently that the entrance shuddered under the pressure. Agnes stood near the opening, her cloak whipping wildly around her as she squinted into the rain. "Someone will be out there," she said simply. Sawney felt the thrill stir in his gut again, the same one he felt when they claimed their first victim. He didn't need persuasion. They waited together, silent as the tide. Hours passed, but the storm did not relent. And then finally a figure appeared on the high path, a man hunched against the wind, clutching a lantern that flickered with each fierce gust. Agnes smiled. The kill was swift, brutal. The man never had time to scream. Lightning lit the sky in a jagged flash, revealing Sawney's silhouette as he sprang from behind the rocks. Agnes helped drag the body into the cave before the tide could wash the blood away. Inside, the man's lantern illuminated the chamber with a soft, golden glow, far gentler than the firelight. It made the space look almost holy, almost peaceful. Sawney laughed at the irony. They ate well that night. But something happened afterwards, something neither of them expected. As they finished the macabre meal, Agnes studied what remained, Bones, scraps of fabric, a few objects the traveler had carried, a flint, a small pouch of coins, a tin whistle. Useless things at first glance. But Agnes saw value in the remnants, not for use, but for identity. She placed them carefully in a shallow alcove, arranging them as if establishing a ritual. Sawney raised an eyebrow. "What are you doing?" She answered, "Making sure we remember. Every piece tells a story, and stories matter." He didn't understand then, not fully, but over time he would see that this idea of keeping what they took formed the foundation of something far larger than survival. Something like legacy or dominion. As the days turned into weeks, the cave slowly transformed. The walls displayed items taken from victims: boots, knives, brooches, badges, pieces of rope, and weathered scraps of clothing. The hoard grew, becoming a grotesque tapestry of lives ended and swallowed by darkness. More travelers vanished along the coast. Some were caught because storms forced them near the cliffs, others because curiosity or misfortune led them down the wrong path. Sawney and Agnes learned to hunt with precision, choosing isolated victims, striking fast, leaving no evidence behind. In time, the villagers began whispering again. This time, it wasn't just fear. It was dread. People spoke of a presence near Bennane Head, a watcher, a shadow that shifted when they blinked, boots disappearing from roads where the mud bore no tracks, the sense that something inhuman waited between the rocks. Sawney relished the rumors. He felt powerful, almost mythic. While the rest of Scotland busied itself with wars and alliances, he had carved out a domain where neither king nor clan held authority. But life inside the cave was changing in more ways than one. Agnes discovered she was with child. The realization came slowly, quietly. She shared the news with Sawney in the dim glow of their fire. He stared at her, unsure what to feel. A father? He had never envisioned anything resembling a family. Yet a fierce pride ignited within him at the thought of a child born of their union, born of the wild, not the world. Agnes's reaction was different. She seemed expectant, focused, almost reverent, as if giving birth in the cave meant something sacred to her twisted mind. "This place will raise them," she murmured one night, hand resting on her belly. Sawney nodded. "They'll be strong. They'll know nothing of fear. And they'll know nothing of rules," Agnes added with a chilling smile. When the child was born, a daughter, the cave echoed with her first cries, high and sharp like a wounded bird. Sawney held her awkwardly at first, the tiny body wriggling in his calloused hands. Agnes watched him, a strange softness passing over her hardened features. "She belongs to the dark, just like us." And that was only the beginning. More children followed in the years after. Some born of Agnes, others born of the daughters when they grew older. There was no morality in the cave, no taboo, no notion of sin. The Bean clan expanded through instinct and savagery. Each child taught from infancy to crawl among bones, to fear nothing, to obey no laws but the will of their parents. Sawney became the patriarch, Agnes the matriarch. Their cave became a hive of whispers, growls, and breath, swelling with the sounds of a family growing like mold in the dark. The older children learned to hunt with their parents. They crawled along the cliffs like feral animals. They learned to smell fear, to distinguish travelers by the weight of their steps, to drag bodies efficiently across the rocks before the tide washed away the footprints. They did not view themselves as human. They viewed themselves as predators. Life inside the cave grew harsher, but also more efficient. They expanded deeper into the labyrinth, discovering chambers large enough to store bodies, dry enough to stack limbs for curing. They smoked strips of meat over smoldering fires, hanging them like macabre garlands from rock ledges. When food was plentiful, the cave filled with the oily scent of cooked flesh. When scarce, they survived on the dried stores that covered the walls like a grotesque pantry. Years passed. The Bean clan grew stronger, faster, more emboldened. Travelers began avoiding the entire stretch of coastline. Merchants took longer, safer routes inland. Villagers locked their doors before sunset. But even fear has limits, and hunger has none. By the time the clan reached over a dozen members, the cave was no longer just a refuge. It was their fortress, their hideout, their sanctuary, their kingdom. A kingdom where Sawney Bean ruled with a crude, savage authority, and Agnes guided the family with a feverish devotion to the savage life she believed fate had chosen for them. Overhead, Scotland changed. Kings rose and fell, battles erupted, alliances shifted. But beneath Bennane Head, nothing changed. The clan remained hidden, untouched, unseen, until the day their boldness would reach beyond the shadows, until the day the world above could no longer ignore the monsters living right beneath their feet. But for now, in the cold chambers of that cavernous underworld, the beans thrived. And the darkness, once empty, pulsed with life, cruel, feral, unstoppable.
The sound of children laughing inside a cave should have been sweet, innocent, a reminder of life taking root even in places where hope had long since vanished. But nothing about the laughter of the Bean children was innocent. Their laughter echoed like the chittering of creatures not meant for daylight. Sharp, wild bursts that ricocheted off stone walls and carried down twisting tunnels like a warning to anything foolish enough to wander near. The Bean clan was growing. In the beginning, Sawney and Agnes had not intended to create a tribe. Children, yes, a family of sorts. But what was forming in the depths of Bennane Head was something else entirely. A lineage shaped not by warmth or nurture, but by hunger, brutality, and a worldview entirely cut off from civilization. The children were born into a world of stone, darkness, and dripping water. Their first cradle was a pile of animal skins laid on uneven rock. Their first toys were bones. Their first lullabies were the rumble of the tide and the muffled screams of travelers unlucky enough to meet their parents. And as more children came, the cave adapted to accommodate them. Older tunnels became sleeping chambers, filled with the thin sounds of breathing. Wider caverns turned into gathering places where the family ate, whispered, and plotted. The alcoves that once held Agnes's trophies now overflowed with trinkets taken from victims, shoes, rusty rings, pieces of torn tartan, daggers, wooden rosaries. These items became both decoration and education. The children learned early that each object represented a kill, a story, a memory soaked in blood. Sawney took pride in it. At night, he stood in the main chamber, watching the flickering firelight dance over the faces of his growing brood. They were sharp-featured, wild-haired, their eyes gleaming with instincts too primal for any civilized child.
Many had his crooked smirk, others bore Agnes's cold, knowing stare. "This is ours," he would say, voice deep with satisfaction. "All of it. The cave, the cliffs, everything the world above forgets."
Agnes stood beside him, hands folded behind her back like a queen surveying her court. They belong to no one, and fear no one. Fear. That was the first law of the Bean clan. Fear nothing. Children crawled through the cave's darkest tunnels long before they could speak clearly. They learned to walk on uneven stone before they learned to walk on flat ground. They learned to navigate by sound, the soft rush of the tide, the distant crack of waves, the quiet scrape of pebble against pebble. And above all, they learned to hunt. Hunting was not introduced gradually. There were no gentle lessons, no warnings, no hesitation. The first time a child killed, it was celebrated. Before they were even old enough to understand death, the children sat beside Sawney and Agnes while the clan carved up victims. They watched small hands sift through piles of bones. They listened to their parents discuss the best ways to strip flesh, to cure meat, to dispose of remains. Nothing was hidden from them. Nothing was sacred. As the years passed, the family grew, not just in number, but in unity. They operated like a pack of wolves, silent when necessary, coordinated without speech, bound by blood and instinct rather than rules or morality. Sawney ruled through strength. Agnes ruled through vision. Her influence over the children was subtle, yet all-encompassing. At night, she gathered them close and told stories, not of saints or kings or heroes, but of monsters, spirits, and creatures that prowl the edges of the world. Stories meant not to frighten, but to inspire. "You are not like them," she whispered, tapping the foreheads of the youngest. "The world beyond these cliffs is weak, sick with rules and illusions. But we are true. We are what men fear when they walk alone." The children listened with wide, unblinking eyes, and they believed her.
The Bean clan did not age like other families. Childhood was short, innocence non-existent. By the age of 7 or 8, the older children joined the hunts. Their movements were lithe and silent, their senses sharp. They watched Sawney tackle a victim with precise brutality, then imitated the technique without hesitation. It wasn't long before the children learned to kill without assistance. If a traveler fell behind his companion, a swarm of small, quick bodies could overwhelm him in seconds. Screams were cut short by hands over mouths, teeth at throats, knives carving through clothing and skin. Sawney watched proudly as his sons and daughters brought home meat, dragging limp bodies over rocks, slick with sea spray. Agnes praised them, brushing blood from their cheeks the way a mother might wipe away crumbs. "You see," she would whisper, "you are becoming strong." The children beamed. Their world did not include religion, but it included ritual. Their world did not include ethics, but it included hierarchy. Their world did not include mercy, but it included loyalty. No one betrayed the family. No one questioned Sawney. No one disobeyed Agnes. And through this chaotic order, the clan became terrifyingly efficient. Travelers along the coast began disappearing more frequently. Entire caravans were ambushed. Merchants stopped journeying near Bennane Head unless traveling in large groups. But even they were not always safe. The beans would watch from the cliffs, their dark silhouettes blending into the rocks. They waited for opportunities, nightfall, fog, stragglers, arguments that separated men from their companions. They struck fast. They struck silently. They left nothing but scattered remnants for the tide to claim. Inside the cave, life flourished in grotesque harmony. The children learned which bones made good tools. They knew how to sharpen blades using stones taken from the coast. They played games that involved stalking, pursuit, and silent takedowns, training disguised as entertainment. The eldest children began forming pairings, mirroring their parents' partnership. To outsiders, it would have been an unspeakable abomination. But in the darkness of Bennane Head, it was simply life, a continuation of the clan, a way to ensure that their numbers and their power never dwindled. Soon, grandchildren arrived, then great-grandchildren. The cave echoed with cries, giggles, whispers, and the skittering of bare feet on stone. Fires burned constantly, filling the air with the scent of charred meat. Food piles grew large enough to feed dozens, replenished by frequent hunts. The Bean clan was now more than a family. It was a tribe, a secret society built on blood and survival. And as they grew, they began to explore the limits of their territory. Some ventured beyond Bennane Head, scavenging inland paths where travelers believed themselves safe. Others climbed higher along the cliffs, learning to move like shadows against the rock. The more the clan expanded, the more emboldened they became. Rumors among villagers turned into fear. Fear turned into avoidance. Avoidance turned into suspicion. But still, no one suspected the truth. The disappearances seemed too random, too impossible to trace. How could a single group be responsible for so many vanished souls over so many years? How could anyone survive in the desolate wilderness for so long without detection? How could something like the Bean clan exist without leaving bodies behind? The sea swallowed the evidence. The cave buried the rest. There were no survivors, no witnesses, no hints of the monster that Scotland was unknowingly feeding. While kingdoms battled and kings changed thrones, the Beans remained untouched, unseen, unchallenged. And in the deepest chamber of the cave, where children played among the bones of the forgotten, where Agnes whispered lessons of savagery, where Sawney sharpened his blades by firelight, a new generation watched and learned, a generation born in darkness, a generation raised for the hunt, a generation that would soon push the legend of Sawney Bean into realms beyond fear.
For now, the world above still slapped, still believed itself safe, still believed the greatest dangers were human ones, bandits, thieves, wolves, or storms. But in the depths of Bennane Head, the Beans knew the truth. They were preparing, growing, waiting, and every generation born in the dark brought the world one step closer to discovering what true terror looked like. As the Bean clan grew, so did their appetite. Not merely the appetite for flesh, but the appetite for violence, domination, and the dark thrill that came from pulling travelers off the roads and into oblivion. What had begun as survival evolved into ritual, almost a sport, one that the clan approached with meticulous precision. The hunts were no longer chaotic ambushes sparked by chance encounters. They became operations, patterns, traditions passed from Sawney and Agnes to their children, and then to the younger ones who learned by staring wide-eyed through the cracks in the cave walls as their elders prepared for the night. At dusk,
The clan moved. At dawn, the coastline wept with emptiness. Sawney devised strategies the way a general prepares for war. He watched the tides. He tracked the travel routes. He memorized the sound of distant wagons long before they came into view. The coastline was his battleground, and he knew every ridge, every shadow, every hiding place. The family learned to move silently along the rocks. Their bare feet were hardened from years of living on stone, gripping the uneven terrain with inhuman balance. Their bodies blended into the cliffs, dark shapes against darker skies. When an unsuspecting traveler approached, the Beans waited. They listened for the rhythm of footsteps, the hesitation of a man doubting his path, the shift of reins as a rider urged his horse onward, the nervous exhale of someone who felt danger but couldn't locate it. Fear scented the air like blood. The attack always came suddenly. Sometimes a single figure darted out to distract the victim while others lurked in the shadows. Sometimes the clan swarmed all at once, fast, overwhelming, like wolves descending on a wounded stag.
No traveler stood a chance against dozens of hands and blades and feral bodies. A man might scream, but the sea absorbed the cry. A horse might rear, but the clan dragged it down with frightening strength. A lantern might drop and shatter, scattering sparks before being quickly stomped out. Then came the quiet, a brutal, unnatural quiet. The kind that left no trace except a smear of darkness washed away by the tide within hours. But killing was only the beginning. Dragging a body across uneven ground was difficult, especially when the winds picked up or the tide threatened to swallow the path. Yet the Beans had perfected their method. The older children carried ropes woven from seagrass, tied expertly around limbs. The younger ones kept watch, small silhouettes perched on the rocks to warn of passers-by. Once inside the cave, the process began with gruesome efficiency. Bodies were stripped of clothing immediately. Agnes believed garments were symbols, tokens of lives claimed. She took satisfaction in arranging them along the walls, creating a grotesque textile gallery. Some pieces grew damp and moldy, others stiffened with dried blood. But Agnes refused to discard any of them. "They show our work," she said with pride. Sawney, meanwhile, sharpened his tools, a collection of rusty knives, daggers taken from victims, and crude blades fashioned from bone and stone. He didn't require sophistication, only sharpness and strength. He hung a lantern from the ceiling, filling the cavern with a weak, flickering glow that cast the bodies into eerie, shifting shapes. Then he would kneel. The carving began. Sawney knew the anatomy of a human body better than most physicians of the era. He understood where to slice to maximize usable flesh. He knew how to separate muscle from bone, how to avoid waste, how to cut with speed before the meat cooled too quickly. His children watched this ritual with fascination. Some assisted by holding limbs steady. Others collected organs in bowls carved from hollowed skulls. No one looked away. The fresh meat was eaten first, raw or roasted depending on the day's needs. The rest was prepared for storage. The clan had developed methods so refined they could have formed the basis of a butcher's handbook if any butcher had been mad enough to write one.
Strips of meat were threaded onto lines of sinew and hung above the fires to smoke. Limbs were placed in saltwater pools in deeper chambers to cure. Bones were crushed for marrow or fashioned into tools. Nothing was wasted. Even the skulls were used, some as vessels, others as decoration. Over time, the cave became a morbid museum of human remains. Bones lined the walls in uneven piles. Skulls stared from ledges with hollow, mocking eyes. Ribs hung like wind chimes in certain tunnels, clacking together when drafts passed through the stone. To the Beans, this was home. To anyone from the outside, it would have been hell incarnate. But the harvesting was not only about feeding their voracious family. It became a means of exerting control over the world beyond the cliffs. Each kill reinforced their belief that they were beyond human law, beyond consequence, beyond fear. And so their confidence grew. They began targeting travelers deliberately, following them for miles before striking. They set crude traps, ropes stretched across narrow paths, rocks positioned to fall at the right moment. They even studied speech patterns, learning to pick out accents, social class, and whether someone might be missed. Sometimes, the clan waited days for the perfect victim. Other times, opportunity walked right into their jaws. One night, a small caravan approached. 3 wagons, 6 men, a woman, and a child. The Beans did not attack immediately. They watched from the cliffs as the group camped for the evening, setting up torches and sharing a meal. Their laughter drifted along the wind like a taunt. Agnes narrowed her eyes. "They're comfortable," she murmured. "Comfort makes people slow." Sawney nodded. "We wait until they sleep." The clan crouched on the rocks like shadows woven into the night. Hours passed. A fire burned low. The travelers lay down, exhausted from their journey. Sawney moved first. Like ghosts descending upon the living, the Beans slipped into the camp. Torches gutted in silent puffs. Knives flashed. Arms and hands wrapped around throats, stifling screams. In moments, the camp was silent except for the crackling of dying embers. But when Sawney approached the final tent, he heard a small whimper. The child. Agnes stepped in front of him. "Give her to me."
He hesitated. Something flickered in his expression, an instinct to let the child live perhaps. A fleeting remnant of the humanity buried deep beneath years of savagery. But Agnes's eyes glinted sharply in the moonlight. "No," she whispered. "Weakness is for them, not us." Sawney stepped aside. By dawn, the entire caravan had vanished, and the cliffside told no story of what happened. Only the faint echo of the sea reclaiming the blood drops missed by the Bean children. For months afterward, no travelers dared cross the coastline. Fears spread across villages like a stain that could not be washed out. Mothers refused to let their sons walk alone. Fathers armed themselves before making even the shortest journeys. Children were warned never to stray near Bennane Head. But fear was not protection. Fear was fuel. The Beans watched the terror grow with the same satisfaction as watching flames climb through dry heather. They understood fear, respected it, manipulated it. Yet the clan did not know caution. Not anymore. They hunted more often, traveled farther, left fewer survivors, and in doing so, they sowed the seeds of their own downfall. For in time, the disappearances would become too many to ignore, too widespread, too horrifying. Even the most skeptical villagers began to suspect something far beyond bandits or storms. Even the king would hear their whispers. But for now, the Beans thrived in their blood-soaked sanctuary.
Each new kill fed their hunger, each new body fortified their growing dominion. The cave pulsed with life, vile, primal, flourishing in the darkness. The beings considered themselves invincible. And nothing is as dangerous as a creature that believes it cannot be stopped. The stretch of road that wound past Bennane Head was only once a rugged inconvenience for travelers, a lonely, wind-beaten path that required caution but promised little danger beyond the fickle weather and steep cliff edges. Yet as the years passed and more souls vanished into that silent oblivion, the road became something else entirely. It became haunted. Not by spirits, at least not spirits that anyone could see, but by the suffocating weight of fear, a fear that clung to the coastline like the mist that rolled in from the sea, a fear that whispered warnings into the ears of travelers, a fear that pressed cold hands against their backs and urged them to move faster, speak softer, avoid shadows. People began calling it the Ghost Road. At first, the name was metaphorical. It referred to those who vanished along it, people who left their homes full of life and were never seen again. Their absence turned them into ghosts in the memories of those they left behind. Ghosts who wandered the road in stories, in nightmares, in the hushed conversations between villagers who did not dare speak too loudly of the horrors they sensed but did not understand. But eventually the name became literal. Travelers swore they saw shapes moving among the rocks, small figures darting across the path, tall silhouettes lingering on the cliffs, pale faces peering from behind boulders before melting into the stone itself. Some heard footsteps behind them, quick and light, but when they spun around, no one was there. Others heard strange clicking noises, like stones knocking together or teeth snapping shut in the dark. Rumors grew, like rot spreading beneath the floorboards of a forgotten house. One man, a tinker from Cavern, claimed he saw a pale child crouched on a rock at dusk. "At first, I thought the wee one was lost," he whispered later in a tavern, shaking so badly that ale sloshed from his cup. "But when I stepped toward it, its head turned in a way no child's head should turn, too fast, too far, and its eyes, God help me, they've reflected the fire like an animal's." He never took the coastal road again. Another traveler described the sound of breathing behind her as she walked, heavy, eager, ragged breathing. She quickened her pace. The breathing quickened too. When she broke into a run, her heart pounding, the breathing followed until she reached the nearest village, stumbling and sobbing at the door of a stranger's home. The villagers found no footprints behind her. But she never slept without a candle again. These stories spread. Stories always do, especially in a land where the unknown has sharp teeth and lurks just beyond sight. The Scottish imagination, already rich with superstition, turned these tales into warnings, and the warnings into lore. But for the Beans, these stories were not fearful. They were amusing. To them, the ghosts on the roads were their own children, the fleet-footed scouts who roamed the cliffs like feral birds. Their pale skin, accustomed to the dim glow of torchlight rather than the sun, made them almost luminous in dusk. Their movements were quick, silent, instinctual. They crouched low, they climbed high, they carried blades at their belts. Mostly, they watched. Sawney and Agnes had trained them well.
The children could track a traveler from a mile away by listening to the rhythm of walking, by sniffing the air for sweat or fear, by watching the flicker of lanterns through cracks in the rock. To them, the people who walked along the ghost road were not threats or mysteries. They were prey. The children followed them not out of curiosity, but to determine when the clan would strike next. Not every traveler was worth the effort. Sawney avoided large groups unless they were weak or poorly armed. He also avoided soldiers, lest their disappearance lead to investigations too close for comfort.
But lone travelers, couples, small groups with a single horse or a single torch, these were perfect. The children became experts at reading the signs of opportunity. A man whose shoulders sagged in exhaustion was easy to pounce on. A woman walking several steps behind her husband meant the clan could snatch her first and divide the couple's attention. A merchant muttering to himself meant he was distracted, unaware of the danger stalking him from above. They learned to lure victims too. A child whimpering in the distance could draw even the toughest warrior into the shadows. A glint of silver on the rocks lured greedy hands. A soft cry for help, perfectly mimicked by one of Agnes's daughters, was enough to send any traveler stumbling off the road and straight into the maw of death. One evening, as fog rolled thick over the coastline, the Beans executed one of their most daring hunts yet. A group of 3 men were moving quickly along the path, torches held high, voices trembling. They had heard the stories about Bennane Head and were determined not to join the list of missing souls. But fear makes people sloppy. One man paused, claiming he saw a figure skittering across the road ahead. Another insisted he heard breathing behind them. The third told them to shut up and keep walking. From high above, the Bean children observed every step. Sawney had taught them to gauge strength not by size or weapons, but by behavior. These men were afraid. Jumpy. Unfocused. Perfect. A single whistle echoed across the cliffs. A soft, nearly musical sound. The men froze. One raised his torch higher, swallowing hard. The flame flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance along the rocks. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. They heard it again. Closer. And then came the laughter. Childlike. Fragile. Wrong. It drifted through the fog like a taunt, like a promise. The men spun around, torches swinging wildly. In their panic, they backed too close to the cliff's edge. A small rock rolled beneath one man's boot, tumbling down the steep drop into the darkness below. Before they could regain their footing, the clan descended. Not all at once. Sawney Bean was too strategic for that. 2 children darted forward first, distracting the men with quick flashes of pale skin and movement. When the men swung their torches, 2 more attackers lunged from behind. The torches fell. Flames hissed out in the wet grass.
One man was shoved off the cliff entirely. His scream ended abruptly somewhere in the depths where the sea roared. The second man fought desperately, swinging his fists and bellowing into the night, but in moments a swarm of hands dragged him down. The survivor ran. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, stumbling over rocks, gasping for air, face streaked with fog and sweat and terror. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Light, rapid, relentless. He did not dare look back, but he felt the presence of something chasing him, something nearly gleeful. By some miracle, he escaped. But the man who finally reached the nearest village was not the same man who had left. He described the attackers not as people, but as things, eyes gleaming in the dark, limbs moving at strange angles, laughter that sounded inhuman, children with faces smeared in blood. The villagers did not know whether to believe him, but the fear grew deeper, and the story spread. Meanwhile, in the cave, the beans celebrated. 2 more bodies hung skinned above the fire, dripping with fat that sizzled as it fell into the flames. Agnes arranged their belongings on the shelves, admiring the new additions to her growing collection. Sawney sat by the fire, sharpening a blade, humming a low, tuneless melody. His children gathered round him, grinning with pride. They were not ghosts, though the world insisted on calling them that. They were hunters, predators, creatures of the cliffs. And as long as the world remained blind to the truth, the ghost road would continue to fill with the silent echoes of the lost, the forgotten, the swallowed. Sooner or later, though someone important would hear the whispers, sooner or later, someone with power would notice the patterns. And sooner or later, Scotland would learn that the ghosts haunting the road were not spirits at all, but the living, breathing horrors of a family born in the dark. The sun was sinking behind the hills, staining the sky a violent red, the kind of red that old storytellers claimed meant blood had been spilled somewhere the night before. Travelers along the coast saw the color and shuddered, some quickening their pace, others muttering prayers beneath their breath. Bennane Head had earned its reputation. No one walked these roads without fear pressing against their ribs. But on this particular evening, a single couple dared to cross the cliffs. Their names were Aidan McCleary and his new bride, Moira. Young, hopeful, and freshly married, they traveled toward Moira's family home, where a celebration awaited. The bride's hair glowed like copper in the dying light, and Aidan's laughter rose with the confidence of a man who believed love could protect against anything. Moira teased him for his bravado. "You laugh now," she said, glancing nervously at the narrowing path. "But folks say this stretch is cursed." "Aye, they say many things," Aidan replied, squeezing her hand. "But curses are made for scaring children, not grown adults." Yet even as he spoke, he kept his other hand close to the dagger at his belt. The path wound dangerously close to the cliff edge, where the sea churned below in a frenzy of foam and dark water. The air felt strange, thick, heavy, cold despite the sunset. Moira kept glancing upward at the rocks. "Just a bit farther," Aidan assured her. "We'll reach safe ground by full dark." But neither of them noticed the silent figures above them. Bean children, 6 of them, crouched like vultures on the rocks. Their eyes gleamed with feral intelligence, their mouths twitched with anticipation. They had been watching the couple approach for nearly an hour. Aidan and Moira were perfect prey, isolated, tired, unaware. One of the older boys, a lanky youth with Sawney's sharp cheekbones, signaled with a flick of his fingers. The others spread out silently, blending into the cracks of the cliff like shadows waiting to pounce. Below, the newlyweds continued their journey. They spoke of their future, of children they hoped to have, of the farm Aidan planned to build with his father, of the songs Moira would teach their little ones. Every step they took was filled with the joy of imagining a life that would never come to pass. Moira stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?"
Aidan paused. Hear what? She turned toward the rocks. Something like footsteps. He listened. Nothing but the distant crash of waves. He tried to laugh, though it came out hollow. "It's only the sea," he assured her. But then they both heard it. A soft pattering, light, quick, unmistakably human. Then a second sound, a whisper of movement above their heads, a breath. Aidan drew his dagger. "Who's there?" he shouted. Silence. He felt Moira tremble beside him. He grasped her hand tighter, leading her forward. "Don't stop. We're almost—" He never finished. A blur dropped from the rocks, landing behind them with inhuman agility. Aidan spun around, raising his dagger just as another figure leaped from the shadows. And another. And another. The couple found themselves surrounded by pale faces, wild hair, eyes that glinted with hunger. Moira screamed. The sound ripped through the air and echoed along the cliffside. It was the kind of scream that should have reached the heavens, the kind of scream that should have drawn help from miles away. But help was not coming. The children closed in. Aidan swung his blade fiercely, slashing the arm of one attacker, but there were too many. Hands grasped his coat, his legs, his shoulders. They dragged him backward, clawing and snarling. He stabbed wildly, shouting Moira's name. Moira herself was yanked toward the cliff edge. She dug her nails into the dirt, fighting with desperate strength. She kicked, twisted, and shrieked as two Bean children grabbed her hair and pulled. Tears streamed down her face. "Aidan!" He saw her slipping. "No!" he roared, breaking free just long enough to lunge toward her. But Sawney Bean was already there. He emerged from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh, massive shoulders, tangled hair, and a grin carved from cruelty itself. His eyes locked on Aidan for a moment, as if savoring the fear before the kill. Then he struck. Aidan's dagger flew from his hand. Sawney swung his arm with brutal force, sending the young man crashing to the ground. His head hit the stone with a sickening crack. Moira's scream broke into sobs. She reached for him, but Sawney grabbed her by the waist and dragged her toward the cave entrance hidden among the rocks. Her nails left bloody streaks in the dirt. The children swarmed Aidan. His vision blurred. He tasted blood. He heard them laughing, high, merciless laughter. And then he felt their hands on him again, pulling him toward the cliff's edge. "No," he gasped. "Please, Moira!" But mercy did not exist in the Bean clan. One final shove sent him tumbling over the cliff. His body fell in silence before being swallowed by the roaring sea. Moira watched the man she loved vanish into the void. Her world shattered in an instant. She kicked and screamed until her voice broke. Sawney slung her over his shoulder like a sack, carrying her with the ease of a man hardened by years of hunting. When they reached the cave, Agnes stood waiting. Even in the dim torchlight, the malice in her eyes was unmistakable. "A fresh one," Sawney grunted, dropping Moira at her feet. Agnes knelt beside the trembling woman. She stroked Moira's cheek almost tenderly. "You're a pretty thing. Pretty things never last long." Moira tried to crawl away, but the children surrounded her in a tight ring, grinning. That night, the Bean clan feasted. But one thing went wrong. Moira did not die quietly. She fought with every ounce of strength in her body, clawing, biting, kicking, screaming long into the night. Her screams carried through the cracks in the cliffside, carried by the wind. And someone heard. A man traveling the opposite direction, an older drover with a stout horse, froze on the road when Moira's scream pierced the darkness. He knew that sound. It was not the cry of an animal. It was not the howl of the wind. It was a woman in terror. His horse pranced nervously, ears twitching. The drover's heart hammered, but he pressed on, moving cautiously along the path. When he saw the disturbed earth, the scattered rocks, the drag marks, he understood. He did not linger. He fled to the nearest village, bursting into the tavern, breathless, pale, shaking. He told the villagers what he had heard, what he had seen, what he suspected. The room went silent. For years the villagers had whispered about disappearances. They had blamed thieves, storms, wolves, even demons. But deep down, They knew something was wrong at Bennane Head. Something worse than wolves. Something worse than bandits.
Something human. Moira's scream and the bloody drag marks left behind finally confirmed their fear. It was the moment that changed everything. Word spread quickly to neighboring villages, then to the local magistrates, then, inevitably, to Edinburgh, and finally all the way to the ears of King James VI himself. A king who did not tolerate threats to his realm. A king who believed in absolute order. A king with a temper that flared hotter than steel in the forge. When he heard how many had vanished along a single route, how many families had begged for justice, how many bones had washed ashore, the king stood from his throne, eyes blazing. "Enough," he said. It was the first crack in the Bean's reign of terror, the first step toward a reckoning long overdue. But deep inside the cave that night, Sawney and his clan laughed, unaware that their latest kill had lit a fire in Scotland, one that would soon burn all the way to their doorstep. For days after Moira's scream tore across Bennane Head, the villages trembled with restless fear. People whispered her name in candlelit rooms, as though speaking too loudly might summon the very creatures that dragged her away. Mothers wept, clutching their children close. Fathers sharpened blades they'd never before used in battle. Every villager felt the same chilling truth settling into their bones. Whatever haunted the cliffs was no longer hiding. And news traveled fast, faster than fear itself. The drover who had witnessed the aftermath of Moira's abduction lost no time. He rode through villages like a man fleeing hell, repeating the story to every elder, every magistrate, every drunkard in the taverns who dared doubt him. Soon the story grew legs, climbing its way north to Edinburgh, where the court of King James VI sat in polished splendor, far removed from the dark realities of the common people. But even kings were not immune to fear. Reports of missing travelers had already reached the palace, counts so high they seemed exaggerated, but consistent enough to hint at something profoundly wrong. When Moira's story arrived, raw with terror and corroborated by dozens of testimonies brought forth over the years, the king's patience snapped. King James VI, a man who believed in order, divine authority, and the absolute power of the crown, did not tolerate chaos, especially chaos that embarrassed the throne. At a late-night council meeting, he slammed his goblet onto the table so hard wine splattered across the silver surface. "I will not have my roads ruled by shadows, nor my people taken like cattle from the fields. Enough of this madness."
The courtiers bowed low, their silks rustling like dry leaves. "What is your will, Majesty?" asked Lord Carrick, a man known for diplomacy rather than steel. The king's voice was cold iron. "We ride at once." Within hours, preparations began. Messengers galloped out across Scotland, summoning the fiercest soldiers, the finest trackers, and every bloodhound trained for hunting fugitives. Armor was polished, weapons were sharpened, horses were fed and saddled. A royal hunt was coming. Not for deer, not for rebels, but for monsters. The king gathered a force so large it cast fear into the hearts of those who watched it assemble. Dozens of cavalrymen in polished breastplates, archers with quivers full of razor-sharp arrows, foot soldiers carrying torches, axes, and pikes, bloodhounds snarling in their chains. The people cheered as the procession left Edinburgh, but behind their cheers was an undercurrent of dread. because even they, for all their hope, doubted that any force, royal or divine, could defeat what waited beneath the cliffs. Meanwhile, in their cave of horrors, the Beans sensed nothing. Sawney sat sharpening a blade with rhythmic focus, scraping metal against stone. Agnes hummed softly as she stirred a cauldron of salted meat. Children scurried like insects through the tunnels, carrying bones, tending fires, muttering to each other in low voices. The cavern smelled of blood, smoke, and old death. A feast was being prepared. Moira had been their latest kill, and her bones still steamed beneath a pile of skins. The younger children poked at the remains, laughing. The older ones sharpened their own small daggers, eager for their next hunt. Sawney glanced toward the cave's entrance, where faint morning light seeped through. "It'll be a good day," he muttered. Agnes nodded. "Every day is, when we take what we want." In that moment, the world outside felt distant, its laws, its kings, its judgments irrelevant. The Beans had been untouchable for decades. The cliffs protected them. The tides erased their crimes. Their clan multiplied faster than any search party could imagine. They believed themselves immortal. But today, the world was coming for them.
The king's procession approached Bennane Head like an approaching storm, slow, deliberate, and impossible to stop. The thunder of hooves rolled across the hills, the air filled with the metallic scent of armor and the heat of torches. Villagers emerged from their homes, watching with wide eyes as the army passed. Children pressed their faces to window glass. Elders crossed themselves. Some whispered prayers for the soul of the land itself. Never before had a king led such a hunt. When they reached the settlement nearest the cliffs, the king dismounted. His boots hit the earth with purpose. He strode to the fearful villagers gathered in the square. "Show me," he commanded. An elder stepped forward, his hands trembling as he held out a lantern. It's not safe, Your Majesty," he stammered. "We've lost too many good folk to those cliffs." The king's eyes hardened. "That is why I am here." The elder swallowed hard and led the king toward the coast. The soldiers followed, torches flickering in the wind. The bloodhounds growled as the scent of decay drifted from the rocks. When they reached the ghost road, the hounds began to pull, noses low, bodies tense. "There," one tracker whispered. "They smell something." The king narrowed his gaze. Let them lead. The hounds surged forward, pulling their handlers toward the cliffs. Soldiers scrambled after them. The wind carried a scent, something metallic, something foul, something unmistakably human. It grew stronger with each step. The hounds' growls deepened, becoming frenzied. They clawed at the rocks, whining, pacing, circling. The tracker frowned. "They sense bodies, sire. Fresh ones." The king stepped closer to the cliff's edge. The tide was low, revealing jagged rocks and crevices usually hidden beneath water. He saw something dark smeared across the stone. Not seaweed, not mud, something darker. He crouched. Blood. Cold swept through him, not fear, but rage.
"Search every inch," he ordered. "The truth is here." Soldiers spread out, scanning the cliffs. One man shouted, "Here, a path!" It wasn't really a path. It was more of a narrow ledge, almost invisible unless someone was looking for it. But at the end of that ledge, tucked into the cliff like the maw of a sleeping beast, was a shadowy opening. A cave. The king's eyes blazed. "Bring torches." Dozens of torches lit the entrance with violent, dancing flames. The air smelled of burning pitch and salt water. Soldiers gathered, their faces tense. "What's inside?" one whispered. Another muttered, "Nothing natural, I wager." The king raised his hand. "We go together, and we do not turn back." Inside the cave, the beans finally sensed something. A tremor in the air, a faint vibration of footsteps, a low rumble, not from the sea, but from men. Agnes lifted her head sharply. "Do you feel that?" Sawney paused mid-slice. The blade hung in his hand. He listened. The sound grew louder, human footsteps echoing down the stone channels. He stood slowly. "Children," he whispered, "to the far tunnels, hide." The younger ones scrambled into the depths. The older ones armed themselves, fear flickering for the first time in their wild eyes. Agnes grabbed Sawney's arm. "No one has ever come this close." Sawney bared his teeth. "Then we show them why they never should have." The torches reached the inner chambers. The shadows danced violently. The soldiers' gasps filled the tunnels. Bones. Everywhere. Piled high. Arranged like grotesque decorations. The king stepped forward, covering his nose as the stench clawed into his throat. "God have mercy!" The sight was unlike anything Scotland had ever known. And then the beans attacked. They erupted from the shadows with shrieks, brandishing blades, teeth bared, eyes blazing with the ferocity of trapped animals. Soldiers stumbled back. Bloodhounds barked madly. The clash began. Steel against stone, screams against snarls, torches scattering sparks across the cavern as chaos erupted. For the first time in their lives, the beans faced opponents who did not run, did not freeze, did not fear them. And the king, standing tall amid the chaos, raised his sword high. "Spare none!" The hunt had begun, and this time it was the beans who were prey. The torches pushed the darkness back in trembling waves, illuminating the twisted heart of the bean family's domain. Soldiers piled into the cavern like a flood of steel and fire, their boots splashing through stagnant pools of seawater. The click of armor, the grind of metal, the panting of bloodhounds, they echoed through the cave like a storm breaking inside the earth. But no roar of nature compared to the horror that awaited them. Bones were everywhere. Not scattered as the remnants of random death, but arranged with grotesque intention. Rib cages hung like wind chimes. Skulls rested in stacked pyramids, eye sockets staring forever into the abyss. Femurs lay in long rows, carved with marks from knives and teeth. Torches cast flickering shadows over it all, making the bones appear to twitch and breathe. One soldier gagged, another crossed himself, knuckles white. The king stood silently at the front of the procession, his jaw clenched so tightly the tendons in his neck bulged. His eyes scanned the cavern, not with fear, but with a cold, simmering fury that seemed to heat the very air. "This," he murmured, voice barely audible, "is an abomination." And then, from somewhere deeper in the darkness, a sound stirred. A hiss, a shuffle, something scurrying, something human, but not quite. Torches lifted higher, soldiers braced themselves, and the beans emerged. They came from the darkness like creatures born from stone itself, faces smeared with ash and dried blood, bodies crouched low, limbs tensed, eyes gleaming with the insanity of cornered predators. The younger ones snarled, crawling along the walls with terrifying ease. Older ones bared their teeth, gripping crude knives carved from bone or stolen from victims. At the center of them all stood Sawney Bean. He was bigger than most had imagined, broad-shouldered, scarred, with a mane of filthy hair and a face hardened by years of savagery. His eyes reflected the torchlight like an animal's, but behind them was something far worse than instinct. There was defiance. Agnes appeared beside him, her hair wild, her grin sharp. Her children formed a ring around her, like wolf pups waiting for the command to kill. For a moment, silence choked the cave. Then Sawney spoke, his voice rough, gravelly, and shockingly calm. "You dare walk into our home?" The soldiers stiffened. Even the torches flickered at the sound of his voice. The king stepped forward, leveling his sword at the patriarch. "You have murdered hundreds. You have devoured my people. By the crown of Scotland, your line ends today." Sawney's smile widened grotesquely. "Then come and take what you think belongs to you." He lunged. The cave exploded into chaos. Sawney slammed into the nearest soldier with a force that sent the man crashing into a pile of bones. The children attacked next, feral, shrieking, fast as lightning. They swarmed the front line, knives flashing, claws digging, teeth snapping, their pale bodies darted through torchlight like specters. One soldier screamed as a bean child sank his teeth into his throat. Another swung his axe wildly, missing his target by inches as a girl leapt onto his back, wrapping her arms around his neck and gouging at his eyes. Arrows loosed from the archers at the rear struck several of the older clan members, sending them crumpling to the stone. The middle-aged brothers, stronger and more brutal, fought with savage fury, lunging low, aiming for vulnerable spots, striking with no fear of death.
A bloodhound broke free of its handler and barreled into a group of children. It tore into them with primal ferocity, jaws snapping, claws scraping. But even as one fell, two more leaped onto the dog, shrieking and stabbing until the beast lay still. The king himself fought at the front, cutting down two clan members in swift, efficient arcs. His armor gleamed with blood, his face was carved with fury. Another bean charged him, blade raised, but a soldier intercepted, tackling the attacker and driving a dagger into his side. Still the beans surged. Still they screamed, clawed, and sank their teeth into anything they could reach. For the first time in their lives, they were fighting not prey, but an enemy who fought back. And the church-like hush of the cave above them roared with the sound of battle. Metal clashing, bodies falling, fire sputtering, and the violent breath of men and monsters in the throes of life and death. Agnes darted through the fray like a viper, slashing at legs, slicing tendons, laughing even when blood sprayed across her face. A soldier swung at her, she ducked, kicked his knee out, and plunged her knife into his thigh. He screamed and fell sideways, knocking over another torch. Flames licked up the wall, illuminating a section of the cavern that had not yet been seen. The soldiers froze mid-fight. There, displayed across the ledges, hung bodies in various states of decay, some freshly killed, some dried and shriveled, some butchered with precision. More bones, more horror, more proof of the clan's atrocities. The sight enraged the king's men. They surged forward with renewed fury. Sawney roared like a beast. He grabbed a soldier by the helmet and smashed his head into the stone wall. Blood sprayed in an arc. A blade slashed Sawney's arm. He barely flinched. He fought like a man possessed. But even monsters bleed. The soldiers were trained, armored, and relentless. The beans were brutal and fearless, but unnumbered and cornered. Slowly, painfully,
The balance began to shift. One by one, the children fell, screaming, snarling, still swinging, even as their bodies weakened. The older clan members were cut down with grim efficiency. Agnes herself was wounded, an arrow in her shoulder, a gash across her ribs. But she kept fighting, spitting blood into the face of anyone who approached. Sawney saw confusion flicker in his children's eyes. Fear, real fear, creeping in for the first time. He bellowed for them to retreat deeper into the cave, but the soldiers blocked every exit. Torches illuminated the entire chamber now. Firelight bounced off the bones, off the wet stone, off the terrified faces of the younger children huddling behind Agnes. There was no escape. The king stepped forward again, his blade dripping red. "Surrender if you have any humanity left." Sawney's chest heaved. His eyes burned. "Human?" he spat. "Look around you. We are closer to the truth of the world than you'll ever be." He charged. This time, 5 soldiers met him at once. Spears drove into his side. A blade slashed across his stomach. Another pierced his back. He staggered, but refused to fall. Agnes shrieked and tried to reach him, but an archer drew his bowstring and released. The arrow struck her heart with a dull thud. She collapsed, dropping her knife, eyes wide with shock. Sawney saw her fall. He roared, a sound so raw and heart-wrenching that even the soldiers froze for a breath. Then one last spear thrust pierced his chest. He dropped to his knees beside Agnes, reaching for her hand. His fingers brushed hers, and for a fleeting heartbeat, the 2 monsters who had birthed a nightmare stared at each other across a chasm of pain. Then Sawney Bean fell. The cavern grew eerily silent. The remaining Bean children, those who hadn't been cut down, were dragged screaming from the darkness, their faces twisted with rage, fear, and confusion. Some bit the soldiers, some spat, some clawed desperately at the stone walls, but they could not escape. The king surveyed the carnage. His expression was carved from frost. "Bind them," he ordered quietly. "All of them. Their fate will be decided in the light of day." The surviving soldiers, bloodied and exhausted, began securing the captives. The dogs whined, the torches crackled, the bones seemed to stare. The Bean lair, once a thriving nest of darkness, now lay in ruins, drenched in blood. And for the first time in decades, the cave knew silence. But justice had not yet been served. Retribution would come soon. A punishment so severe it would echo through Scotland for centuries. The Beans were captured. The reckoning had only just begun. Dawn crept across the Scottish hills the way a wounded soldier limps across a battlefield, slow, heavy, streaked with red. The first light stretched its fingers toward Bennane Head, dispelling the shadows that had hidden the Bean clan for decades. For the first time, the sun touched the entrance to their lair without fear, washing the dark stone walls in pale gold. The Bean family, however, did not see the sunrise as anything but a cruel omen. They were dragged from the cave like beasts, their wrists bound with ropes so tight they cut into the flesh. Chains were fixed around their ankles, clanking as they stumbled over uneven ground. Some hissed like cornered animals, others growled low, trying to bite the soldiers who pulled them forward. The youngest cried, screeching, kicking, refusing to be handled by the hands of strangers. After years beneath the earth, the daylight burned their eyes. Many blinked rapidly, squinting, some even thrashing as if the sun itself were attacking them.
Sawney and Agnes lay lifeless inside the cave,
their bodies too mangled and bloodied to be moved until the soldiers finished securing the children. Only then did they return to carry the patriarch and matriarch out. Their corpses were bound in rough cloth, not out of respect, but because no one wished to see their faces again. The king watched it all with an expression void of triumph. This was not victory. This was cleansing, a necessary purge of something deeply unnatural. The surviving villagers had gathered at a distance. They stood on the cliffs in small groups, wrapped in shawls and cloaks, whispering prayers. Some crossed themselves when they saw the children being dragged out, as if unsure whether the captives were demons wearing human shapes. A widow stepped forward, tears burning in her eyes. Are they the ones?" she stammered. The king did not turn toward her. He did not have to. "Yes," one of the soldiers answered. "They are." The widow pressed her trembling hands to her mouth. Her husband had vanished on the road the previous spring. She stared at the Bean children as if searching for a sign, some scrap of fabric, some token that might confirm her worst fears. She collapsed into sobs before she found it. The king ordered his men to move. They marched south towards Edinburgh. The surviving clan members, 15 in total, were bound together in a long procession. They limped, staggered, and snarled, occasionally shrieking curses in a guttural dialect that barely resembled human speech. The youngest were carried in makeshift slings, wailing like injured animals. No one pitied them. They had carved their lives from the bodies of innocents. The land demanded justice, and justice would be delivered with merciless precision. The journey to Edinburgh took several days. Along the way, villagers lined the roads to watch the procession pass. Some spat at the captives, others threw stones. Mothers held their children close, warning them in hushed voices. This is what happens when evil goes unchallenged. Some children hid their faces. Others stared wide-eyed at the Bean clan, fascinated and horrified by the sight of these feral people who had feasted on human flesh. The Beans did not understand the spectacle. They had lived their entire lives believing themselves untouchable, the kings of their hidden realm. Now they were paraded as monsters. At night, soldiers kept guard around the camp with strong torches and sharpened pikes. The Beans huddled together for warmth, whispering in their strange, broken dialect. Every so often, one would lunge at a guard, only to be beaten back.
The soldiers took no joy in it. They did what was necessary. By the time they entered Edinburgh, the city was ready. Word had spread. The capital buzzed with morbid curiosity. What kind of people could commit such atrocities? Were they human at all? What punishment awaited those who devoured their own kind? The king made sure the Beans were displayed before the public not for entertainment, but for proof. Proof that evil had been real, festering beneath the kingdom. He ordered no trial. Some crimes are so immense, so vile, so undeniable that justice must be immediate. The people gathered in the execution yard, a broad, grim space surrounded by stone walls and wooden scaffolding. Soldiers lined the perimeter. Torches crackled. The crowd murmured, growing louder with every passing moment. When the Bean clan was marched into the yard, a wave of gasps swept through the assembly. They looked less like people and more like creatures sculpted by darkness. Wild hair, pale skin, eyes that glittered with hatred rather than fear. The king stepped forward, raising a hand for silence. The yard fell still. "These," he declared, his voice echoing through the air, "are the murderers who plagued our lands for decades. They killed without mercy. They defiled the bodies of their victims. They feasted upon human flesh. They lived like beasts, and they shall die as such." The crowd exploded in shouts of rage, disgust, relief. The bean snarled back, uncomprehending. The king continued, "Let this be a warning to all who threaten the realm. Justice will always find you." He turned sharply and walked away, his cloak billowing behind him like a shadow of authority. The executions would proceed without him. Justice was now in the hands of the royal executioners, men whose faces showed no fear, only grim determination. The male Bean clan members were dragged first. Soldiers forced them to the racks, where their limbs were chained to posts. The executioners carried heavy iron tongs heated in blazing coals. The instruments glowed red, radiating waves of suffocating heat. The crowd fell silent as the first scream split the air, a raw, piercing sound that echoed off the stone walls. The punishment was brutal, designed to strip away not only life, but the very physical strength that had enabled their crimes. Each man was dismembered alive, hands, feet, then limbs severed joint by joint. Their screams grew weaker, their bodies trembled, their eyes rolled back. One by one, they fell silent. The crowd watched with shock and satisfaction. There was no pity here, no mercy for those who had shown none. Next came the women and older girls. They too were executed without hesitation, strangled, burned, or cut down according to the king's orders. Many cursed their captors, some spit blood. A few screamed for Sawney Bean, even though he was already dead. But none were spared. Finally, the youngest children were brought forward, those barely old enough to walk, yet raised in violence so complete they lunged and snapped at the guards like feral wolves. Some in the crowd murmured uneasily. Punishing full-grown cannibals was one thing. Executing children, even monstrous ones, was another. But the executioners hesitated only briefly. The king's decree had been clear. The Bean bloodline must be erased entirely. The children were hanged swiftly. Their small bodies dangled in the morning mist, swaying gently like dead leaves on a branch. By the time the sun reached its highest peak, it was over. Every surviving member of the Bean clan was dead.
Their remains were burned in a massive pyre beyond the city walls. The smoke rose high, billowing like a dark plume against the sky. The smell of burning flesh drifted across the fields, a final echo of the horrors the family had inflicted for so long. Scotland breathed again. Villagers reclaimed the roads. Merchants dared to travel near Bennane Head once more. Parents allowed their children to walk to school without trembling every time the wind rustled the grass. The land healed, slowly, cautiously, but it healed. The Bean family was gone, their cave abandoned, their kingdom reduced to ash. Yet even as the smoke faded and the last embers died, something lingered, something that would never fully disappear. A story, a warning, a legend born from darkness, blood, and unspeakable cruelty. The Bean clan was dead, but their shadow would live on. Long after the ashes of the Bean clan cooled and scattered across the windswept fields outside Edinburgh, a strange quiet settled across Scotland. It was the quiet that follows a storm, heavy, uncertain, trembling with the uneasy knowledge that the world had been forever changed. The immediate horror faded first, the gruesome executions, the pyres,
the grim discovery of bones stacked like trophies in the damped recesses of Bennane Head. But the story, the story, that was something different entirely. Stories do not die when bodies burn. Stories grow, they shift, mutate, find new voices, and the tale of Sawney Bean became something more than a memory. It became legend. For weeks afterward, the king's messengers rode across the country, announcing the victory over the Cannibal clan. They described the hunt, the cave, the bones, the children who had grown teeth sharp enough to tear flesh. Villagers listened in horror, crossing themselves or muttering prayers. Some wept for the victims, others thanked the king for his righteous wrath. But even then, questions simmered beneath the surface. How had an entire family, dozens strong, remained hidden for so long? How had no one discovered the cave earlier? Could a bloodline so savage truly grow from nothing but isolation and hunger?
Some whispered that the Beans couldn't possibly have killed as many as the king claimed. Others insisted the number must have been far higher. Merchants spoke of entire caravans that vanished, young widows of husbands who'd never returned, parents of children who'd wandered too far near the cliffs. But as the story spread farther, from inn to inn, village to village, border to border, details began to warp, the way truth often does when carried by too many tongues. In one version, Sawney Bean was a nobleman's bastard child, cast out for wickedness. In another, he was the cursed son of a witch. Some claimed Agnes Douglas had been a sorceress who bewitched him. Others said the entire family was born of demons. The more time passed, the less human the story became. But what remained constant, what every retelling preserved, was the fear. People avoided Bennane Head long after the Beans were dead. Fishermen refused to cast nets near the area, claiming the sea still tasted of blood. Travelers kept to inland roads no matter how much longer the journey took, and children dared one another to go near the cliffs, only to run away screaming when the wind howled too sharply or a gull's cry echoed strangely. Still, some were not convinced. Decades after the execution, a scholar named Malcolm Struan traveled across Scotland to investigate the truth behind the legend. He arrived in towns where the story had taken root, interviewing elders who spoke in fragile voices about memories passed down through their grandparents. He visited the coastline, stood on the cliff edge, and felt the cold breath of the sea rising from below. But when he ventured toward the cave itself, he found the entrance nearly sealed by collapsed rock, a result of tides, time, and perhaps a bit of deliberate effort by villagers who wanted to bury the past forever. Still, Struan managed to squeeze through a narrow gap and descend into the darkness. What he found inside chilled him to the bone. Bones still littered the deeper chambers. Not freshly preserved, of course, weathered, scattered, stripped by time, but unmistakable. Human bones. Children's bones. Bones that bore the marks of knives and teeth. The cave smelled of damp earth and salt, not the stench of death that once filled it, but the atmosphere still felt heavy, weighted, as if the stone remembered.
He returned the next day with lanterns and assistants, determined to document every inch. Some villagers begged him not to disturb the place. They believed the spirits of the Beans lingered, hungry for vengeance. Struan ignored them. On the third day, he emerged with dozens of sketches, notes, measurements, and what he called the closest thing to truth this legend will ever yield. But even he admitted the story was not simple. Were they monsters, he wrote in his journal, Or men driven beyond reason by isolation and hunger? Or does the truth lie somewhere between cruelty and necessity? His notes suggested possibilities historians still debate centuries later. Perhaps Sawney Bean existed, but not as described in the king's proclamations. Perhaps he was a bandit who recruited other outcasts. Perhaps stories of cannibalism were exaggerated to justify a brutal royal execution. Perhaps there had been no children born in the cave at all, just a handful of criminals twisted into myth. Or perhaps every word was true. Perhaps the Beans were the worst kind of monsters, people who chose savagery willingly. Years passed, then generations. The memory of the Beans faded from the daily fears of villagers, but settled into the folklore of the nation. Tales were told beside hearth fires. Traveling bards added dramatic flair. Mothers used the story to frighten misbehaving children. If you don't behave, the Bean clan will come for you in the night. Tourists began visiting Bennane Head out of curiosity rather than terror, though few dared to climb too close to the cliffs. Superstitions lingered. Fishermen tossed offerings into the waves for the lost souls. Shepherds avoided grazing their flocks too near the cave mouth.
Even scholars disagreed. Some insisted the story was a political tool, the king embellishing a threat to justify his power. Others pointed to similar tales across Europe, stories of cave-dwelling cannibals as evidence of a cultural archetype, a psychological fear manifested into narrative. But then there were those who believed in the truth wholeheartedly. The bones found in the cave, the records of missing travelers, the old maps marking the coastline as dangerous, the oral histories passed down through centuries, and something else. Sometimes, when the wind howled as if mourning, people swore they heard it, a faint sound echoing from deep within the rocks. A sound like footsteps, or laughter, or the scrape of bone against stone. Of course, skeptics claimed it was the sea, just the sea whispering through the narrow cracks. But those who lived nearest to Bennane Head shook their heads, eyes darkening. "No," they said, "the sea doesn't sound like that." So what was the truth? Was Sawney Bean real or a horrifying fiction? Were the Beans truly cannibals or victims of political propaganda? Did their children exist? Did the king slaughter innocents to prove a point? Or did he destroy a family of monsters whose hunger would have consumed half of Scotland? No historian has ever agreed. No evidence has ever settled the debate. And the cave itself has become a riddle, half open, half sealed, half forgotten, half remembered. But the story continues.
It lingers in the minds of those who walk the coast. It chills the hearts of travelers who wander near sunset. It haunts scholars who dig too deeply into the past. It inspires ghost hunters, folklorists, and storytellers alike. Because some legends survive not through proof, but through fear. Fear that something like the Bean clan could happen again. Fear that the darkest parts of humanity are closer to the surface than we wish to believe. Fear that somewhere, in some forgotten corner of the world, another cavern waits. Empty now, but not forever. The line between myth and memory is thin, and the story of Sawney Bean walks that line like a shadow on the cliff edge, never fully gone, never fully real, forever watching. Centuries have passed since the fires of Edinburgh consumed the remains of the Bean clan, Yet time has never been able to silence the story they left behind. The smoke has long since drifted into the sky. The bodies have dissolved into ash and soil, and the roads once haunted by their presence have been paved, traveled, and forgotten by most. But legends are far more enduring than flesh. Along Scotland's rugged western coastline, where the sea meets stone with a fury unchanged by the centuries, the cliffs of Bennane Head still rise like a jagged scar against the sky. Waves still crash at their base, eternal and vicious. The wind still howls through the crevices of the rocks. The mist still clings to the heather, rolling in thick curtains that blur the boundaries between land, sea, and sky. And in that mist, the echoes of the past linger. It begins softly, an unease that settles into the bones of anyone who wanders too close to the old paths. Even modern hikers, armed with maps and equipment, speak with a strange tremor in their voices after walking the narrow trails. Some say the air feels wrong, colder than it should be, as if the land itself is trying to warn them away.
Others report hearing faint sounds, a distant shuffle of feet, the clatter of pebbles disturbed by movement, or a strange, hollow tapping like bone knocking against bone. Sometimes it's just the sea playing tricks. Sometimes it's nothing more than imagination. But sometimes it is something else. Just offshore, the waves lap at the mouth of a half-hidden crevice, once the entrance to the Bean family's domain. Centuries of storms have battered the rock, collapsing tunnels and burying chambers beneath layers of stone. Most of the cave system is inaccessible now, swallowed by the earth and sealed by nature. But a single narrow fissure remains, just wide enough for a curious adventurer to peer inside. When the tide is low and the sun hangs at the right angle, one can see the faintest glimpse of the cave's dark throat. It seems to breathe with the pulse of the sea. Some visitors swear the air that drifts out smells faintly of decay, even though there are no bodies left to rot. A few brave souls over the years have tried to squeeze through the entrance. Most returned quickly, pale-faced and shaken. They claimed the darkness inside felt alive, heavier than any shadow they had ever known. The walls seemed to whisper when the wind passed through the cracks. One man, a historian named Alistair MacBain, emerged trembling and refused to speak for days. When he finally did, he said only, "There are things in the dark that remember we do not belong there." He never returned. As the centuries rolled onward, Bennane Head became a place of uneasy fascination. Not quite a tourist attraction, its terrain is far too dangerous for casual wanderers, but a place sought out by those hungry for history, thrill, or the macabre. Locals guide them only so far. Few will take visitors near the exact location of the cave. It's not that the beans are still there, one old fisherman often says, his voice lowered to a whisper, but the fear they carved into the land never left.
Fear does that. It lingers long after the danger is gone. In nearby villages, children still grow up hearing the story. Parents tell it during storms, when the wind screeches along the windows and the children huddle close to the fire. The tale has become a rite of passage, a reminder that the world can be cruel, and that darkness can grow even where no one expects it. "Stay close to the path," they warn. "Don't wander too far. Beware the cliffs. And if you hear laughter in the wind, run." Of course, the logical mind dismisses it. Cannibal clans? Hidden caves? Hundreds of victims vanishing without notice? A king personally leading a hunt through the night? It all sounds too dramatic, too theatrical, too steeped in fear to be entirely real. Scholars continue to debate the veracity of the story. Some insist it is nothing more than folklore, crafted to entertain or to frighten. Others point to the archaeological evidence unearthed along the coast, scattered bones, markings on stone, historical records of unusual disappearances. The truth lies tangled somewhere between the facts and the fear. Perhaps the beings were real. Perhaps they were myth. Perhaps history exaggerated them. Perhaps history softened them. What is undeniable is the power the story holds, the grip it maintains on the imagination of Scotland and beyond. It is a story that speaks to primal fears, the fear of being watched, the fear of the unknown, the fear of becoming prey in a world where safety is often an illusion.
For every generation, the legend reshapes itself. In some retellings, the beans are monstrous creatures, barely human. In others, they are victims of circumstance, warped by isolation. Some versions soften the brutality, others heighten it. And the cave itself shifts from a real place to a symbolic pit of sin and savagery. But the ending never changes. Their downfall, their capture, their execution, their erasure. And yet, they are never truly erased. Just as the tide returns each day to strike the rocks, the story returns to strike at the imagination. Teachers speak of it in hushed tones, tour guides mention it with a shiver, and thrill seekers whisper about sneaking near the cliffs under the moonlight. And occasionally, rarely, but enough to stoke rumors, someone goes missing near Bennane Head. Search parties are sent. Names are called into the wind. Lanterns swing in the darkness. Most of the time, the missing person wandered off the path or was claimed by the unforgiving cliffs. Nature is cruel enough without legends. But every now and then, locals speak of strange details surrounding certain disappearances. An abandoned boot with teeth marks, drag marks that lead nowhere, or the faint sound of laughter echoing along the rocks at dusk. Coincidence? Perhaps, but legends thrive in coincidence. Even today, as the sea crashes violently below and the gulls wheel overhead, the cave remains a wound in the land, a reminder of what once hid there and what may hide again if the world forgets to fear the dark. The wind sweeps across the cliffs, carrying with it the voice of the sea. A long, hollow moan that sounds dangerously close to a whisper. Some say if you listen closely, you can hear the echoes of the Bean clan calling from beneath the earth. Not in pain, not in sorrow, but in hunger. Because stories like theirs do not fade easily. They do not sleep. They wait. And if the legend of Sawney Bean has taught the world anything, it is this. Darkness does not disappear when light arrives. It retreats into caves, into shadows, into stories. And there it bides its time, waiting for the next traveler to step too close, waiting for the next voice to scream in the night, waiting for someone, anyone, to believe the coast is safe again. But Bennane Head remembers. The cliffs remember. The sea remembers. And Scotland, whether it admits it or not, remembers too.
Like all legends born from blood and fear, the story of Sawney Bean endures, not because it must, but because it refuses to die. And in the restless winds that circle the cliffs at dusk, the echo of that story still whispers, "Beware the dark. Beware the hunger. Beware the places where the earth opens its jaws. For some monsters do not stay buried. They simply wait in silence."